For generations, the frontier was a place of endless challenge and unforgiving beauty. But amidst the vast, silent forests and towering, snow-capped mountains, whispers began to spread. Whispers of something ancient and terrible. Tales of a pack of wolves, not of this world, not of this size, terrorizing isolated settlements. Their howls were said to shake the very foundations of the earth, and their hunger knew no bounds. They were a force of nature, a legend given flesh. And one cold winter, a group of brave men decided to hunt this legend. They were driven by greed, by honor, by the simple need to survive. But as they ventured deeper into the wilderness, they learned a terrifying truth. You don't hunt a legend. A legend hunts you back. And when the snow turned red, and the silence was broken only by the screams, only two of them would return. This is their story. A story of a hunt that turned into a nightmare. Chapter 1. The Call for Hunters. The air, thin and cold, thrummed with the weight of ancient tales. They had left the meager warmth of the town behind, swallowed by a forest of towering, skeletal pines and a snow that seemed to hold its breath. The silence was heavier than the biting wind, broken only by the crunch of their boots and the rasp of their own breaths. Liam, clutching his rifle a little too tightly, finally broke the quiet. "My grandpappy used to tell me stories about this place," he muttered, his gaze darting between the dark, silent trees. "He said the mountains here, they're haunted by something ancient." Elias, the veteran, didn't even look at him. He was scanning the tree line with eyes that had seen more than any man should. "Every mountain has its ghosts, kid. Most of them are just stories to keep the children in their beds. Not these." Ilara's voice was a whisper on the wind, a sound so soft it was almost gone. She walked with a hunter's grace, her feet leaving barely a mark in the snow. "They call them the whisper wolves in my family. Not because of their howl, but because you never hear them coming. They move like shadows, and the cold that follows them is not from the air, but from the grave." A flashback, a flicker of memory, washed over Ilara. She was a child again, huddled by a fire. Her grandmother's voice a low drone as she spun a yarn of impossible creatures. "They are the spirits of the deep cold," her grandmother had said, her eyes wide with a fear that was 100 years old. When a hunter takes too much from the wild, when he breaks its sacred balance, the whisper wolves are sent to collect the debt. They do not kill for food, they kill for a reckoning. The wolves in her grandmother's story were not made of flesh and bone, but of frozen mist and sharp black ice. Their eyes weren't a feral yellow, but a malevolent, pulsating green. She had always dismissed it as a fanciful legend, a warning for reckless hunters. But now, in this silence, surrounded by the towering, watchful trees, the story felt less like a tale and more like a premonition. The scarred hunter, who hadn't spoken since they left, finally turned to look at Ilara. His eyes, two chips of coal in a face weathered by 1,000 winters, held a haunted recognition. "They're not spirits," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "They're a new kind of terror. I saw one once. Just a flash, a shadow that moved faster than any beast I've ever tracked. My partner, he didn't even have time to scream." He stopped, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance, a flicker of a ghost on his face. He didn't offer any more details, but the single grim fact hung in the air. He was the sole survivor of a past hunt, a past that had followed him here. Liam, his youthful bravado now completely gone, swallowed hard. "So we're not just hunting wolves?" We're hunting something from a story? All great hunters know the old stories, kid, Elias said, his grip tightening on his rifle. They're not just stories. They're warnings. Just then, they came to a clearing. The snow was undisturbed, save for a single, impossibly large paw print. It was the size of a dinner plate, deeply etched into the frozen ground. But it wasn't the size that made them freeze. It was the number of claws. 5, not 4. And the print radiated an unnatural cold, a chill that seemed to sink directly into their bones. The legends were not just stories. They were true, and whatever creature had made this track was waiting for them. Chapter 2. Gathering the Brave. The chilling echo of the distant howl died, leaving an even deeper silence in its wake. Inside the tavern, the air thickened, not just with smoke and ale, but with an unspoken question hanging over the few hardened souls who remained. The general murmur of voices had ceased, replaced by the nervous clatter of a dropped mug. Liam, the young trapper, nervously tugged at the brim of his hat, his face pale beneath the flickering lamplight. That wasn't any wolf I've ever heard, he whispered, his eyes wide. He'd lived his whole life on the edge of the wilderness, but that sound, ancient and predatory, was entirely new. Elias, the veteran hunter, didn't flinch. His gaze, however, swept the room, resting momentarily on each face, assessing. His own face, a roadmap of harsh winters and brutal encounters, was impassive. He knew fear, but he also knew how to master it. "No, son," he rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. It wasn't. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes holding the weary knowledge of a man who had seen too much. He remembered the last time a sound like that had chilled the frontier. A grizzly, enraged by a territorial dispute, had decimated a trapper's camp. But this howl had a different quality, a deeper resonance that spoke of something far more intelligent, far more sinister. Across the room, Ilara, the shadow, moved from her corner, her footsteps unheard until she was already standing by their table. Her cloak, the color of twilight, seemed to absorb the dim light, making her almost invisible against the backdrop of the tavern's rough-hewn walls. "The legends speak of such a sound," she murmured, her voice a low, resonant hum, like wind through dry reeds. A call not of hunger, but of dominion. She didn't look at any of them directly, her eyes, sharp and intelligent, fixed on the closed tavern door, as if she could see through the wood, through the snow, and into the dark, waiting forest beyond. She thought of her years spent tracking, of the near-mythical beasts she had pursued, elusive cougars, cunning bears, but nothing that evoked the primal dread that this new threat did. Her family, old dwellers of these mountains, always spoke of the Old Ones, creatures intertwined with the very essence of the unforgiving landscape. She had scoffed at such tales as a child, but now a cold knot formed in her stomach. The scarred man, known only as Cain by those who dared to speak to him, finally pushed himself from the table. His movements were slow, deliberate, every muscle in his lean frame coiled and ready. "Legends don't leave tracks this deep," he rasped, his voice raw as he walked towards the map pinned to the wall, ignoring the tavern owner who stared wide-eyed from behind the bar. "This isn't a story. This is a war." He tapped a spot far to the north, deep in the frozen expanse of the uncharted territory. His own flashback was a brief, brutal flash. The swirling snow, the sudden, unnatural silence, and then the blur of an impossible shape, massive and dark, that had torn through his camp, leaving only destruction and the lingering scent of ozone and fear. He had barely escaped, carrying scars that ran deeper than skin. The bounty, initially a glittering promise of wealth, now felt like a death sentence written in gold. The four of them, the hopeful Liam, the hardened Elias, the enigmatic Alara, and the haunted Cain, stood under the flickering light, each weighing their reasons. Elias loaded his rifle with a grim finality. "Are we in, or are we out?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over them. Liam, though trembling, found a desperate resolve. "I'm in. Can't live like this, waiting for them to come to town." Ilara nodded slowly, her eyes still on the door. "There are some debts that only the wild can settle." All eyes turned to Cain. He paused, his hand resting on the hilt of his massive hunting knife, the only weapon he seemed to truly trust. His silence was heavy, a storm brewing. Then, without a word, he simply walked towards the door, his shadow stretching long and distorted behind him, a dark silhouette against the dim light. They were leaving the known world behind, stepping into the realm of the unknown. And the only question that mattered now was not if they would find the wolves, but what would find them first. The wind howled outside, a mournful lament, as the door creaked open, revealing the boundless, snow-covered expanse beyond. Chapter 3. Legends of the Giant Wolves. The air, thin and cold, thrummed not with the wind, but with the weight of ancient tales. They had left the meager warmth of the town behind, swallowed by a forest of towering skeletal pines and a snow that seemed to hold its breath. The silence was heavier than the biting wind, broken only by the crunch of their boots and the rasp of their own breaths. Liam, clutching his rifle a little too tightly, finally broke the quiet. "My grandpappy used to tell me stories about this place," he muttered, his gaze darting between the dark, silent trees. "He said the mountains here, they're haunted by something ancient." Elias, the veteran, didn't even look at him. He was scanning the tree line with eyes that had seen more than any man should. "Every mountain has its ghosts, kid. Most of them are just stories to keep the children in their beds." "Not these." Ilara's voice was a whisper on the wind, a sound so soft it was almost gone. She walked with a hunter's grace, her feet leaving barely a mark in the snow. "They call them the whisper wolves in my family. Not because of their howl, but because you never hear them coming. They move like shadows, and the cold that follows them is not from the air, but from the grave." A flashback, a flicker of memory washed over Ilara. She was a child again, huddled by a fire, her grandmother's voice a low drone as she spun a yarn of impossible creatures. "They are the spirits of the deep cold," her grandmother had said, her eyes wide with a fear that was 100 years old. "When a hunter takes too much from the wild, when he breaks its sacred balance, the whisper wolves are sent to collect the debt. They do not kill for food. They kill for a reckoning." The wolves in her grandmother's story were not made of flesh and bone, but of frozen mist and sharp, black ice. Their eyes weren't a feral yellow, but a malevolent, pulsating green. She had always dismissed it as a fanciful legend, a warning for reckless hunters. But now, in this silence, surrounded by the towering, watchful trees, the story felt less like a tale and more like a premonition. The scarred hunter, who hadn't spoken since they left, finally turned to look at Ilara. His eyes, two chips of coal in a face weathered by 1,000 winters, held a haunted recognition. "They're not spirits," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "They're a new kind of terror. I saw one once, just a flash, a shadow that moved faster than any beast I've ever tracked. my partner. He didn't even have time to scream. He stopped, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance, a flicker of a ghost on his face. He didn't offer any more details, but the single grim fact hung in the air. He was the sole survivor of a past hunt, a past that had followed him here. Liam, his youthful bravado now completely gone, swallowed hard. So we're not just hunting wolves. We're hunting something from a story? All great hunters know the old stories, kid, Elias said, his grip tightening on his rifle. They're not just stories. They're warnings. Just then, they came to a clearing. The snow was undisturbed, save for a single, impossibly large paw print. It was the size of a dinner plate, deeply etched into the frozen ground. But it wasn't the size that made them freeze. It was the number of claws. 5, not 4. And the print radiated an unnatural cold, a chill that seemed to sink directly into their bones. The legends were not just stories. They were true, and whatever creature had made this track was waiting for them. Chapter 4. Into the Wilderness. The single monstrous paw print was a gauntlet thrown down, and the hunters, with grim determination, accepted the challenge. Following the tracks was like tracing a wound in the earth itself. They led away from the well-trodden paths of man, deeper and deeper into a part of the forest no sane person dared to enter. Here the pines grew twisted and gnarled, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at a perpetually gray sky. The air, already frigid, seemed to drop to a new, unnatural cold with every step they took. A biting chill that went beyond weather and settled deep in their bones. Liam, the trapper, kept glancing over his shoulder, his breath a nervous puff of steam. This place, it doesn't feel right. The birds, they're gone. Everything's too quiet. He was right. The usual sounds of the wild, the distant caw of a crow, the chatter of a squirrel, were absent. The silence was an active force, a heavy blanket that smothered all life. Elias, the veteran, his face a mask of weary concentration, simply grunted in response. His eyes, however, betrayed his own unease as they scanned the dense undergrowth. He had spent a lifetime in these woods, and this was in silence he had never encountered. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. "And the wild is a living thing," Alara said softly, her voice barely audible above the crunch of snow. "And this part of it, it's dead, or waiting to be. They've cleansed it." She moved with a preternatural grace, her senses alert to every shifting shadow, every subtle change in the wind. She thought back to the legends, of the wolves as a force of nature, a reckoning for those who trespassed too far. Now, seeing the desolate landscape they had created, she realized the old stories were not just warnings. They were blueprints of a brutal and efficient campaign. Cain walked ahead of the group, his movements fluid and silent, as if he were part of the very shadows that clung to the trees. He didn't speak, but his hand never strayed far from the hilt of his massive knife. His eyes, usually guarded and empty, were now sharp with a dangerous focus. He recognized this desolation. It was the same silent, suffocating dread that had preceded his last brutal encounter. A memory, cold and sharp, flashed through his mind. The sudden stop of his partner's happy whistling, the unnatural stillness, and the feeling of being watched by 100 eyes that weren't there. He knew they were not alone. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows, they came upon a clearing. The sight that greeted them stole the breath from their lungs. Stretched out before them were the skeletal remains of a dozen deer and elk, their bones picked clean. scattered across the snow like a macabre work of art. But the kill was wrong. There were no claw marks or bite marks on the bones, no signs of a struggle. The carcasses looked as if they had been meticulously stripped, every ounce of flesh consumed without a single drop of blood being spilled on the ground. It was an impossible hunt, a slaughter conducted with terrifying precision. And carved into the trunk of a large, ancient oak at the center of the clearing was a symbol they had never seen before. A stylized wolf's head, its eyes glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. It wasn't a sign of an animal. It was a message. And they had just walked into the heart of their territory. The hunters froze, their rifles raised, their hearts pounding in a frantic rhythm against the silent, watching trees. They were finally here, and so were the wolves. Chapter 5. Tracks in the Snow. The air in the clearing was cold, but the chill that settled in their bones had nothing to do with the temperature. The hunters stood frozen, their rifles aimed at the scattered, bloodless remains. The impossible kill, the 5-clawed paw print, and the strange, glowing symbol carved into the tree. It was a brutal symphony of the unnatural. They didn't tear them apart, Liam stammered, his voice a terrified whisper. They just unmade them. Elias, the veteran, knelt by a deer carcass, his face a mask of disbelief. He ran a gloved hand over a clean, stripped bone. There were no marks, no teeth gouges. I've never seen anything like it. This wasn't a frenzy. This was a statement. Ilara's eyes were fixed on the symbol on the tree trunk. The faint, emerald light seemed to pulse with a malevolent rhythm. My grandmother's stories, they spoke of a pact between the ancient spirits and these wolves. The beasts, they consume the essence of the prey, not the flesh. She looked at Cain, who stood silently, his gaze fixed on the symbol as if it held a personal, painful memory. This isn't just hunting. This is a ritual. Cain simply shook his head, a grim shadow passing over his face. A ritual of a killer that knows you're following. Look. He pointed to the snow. Leading away from the clearing were the tracks, but now there were many. A dozen or more sets of the impossibly large 5-toed prints, leading in different directions. They had found the pack, but the pack was also aware of them. The tracks wove and crisscrossed in a complex, taunting pattern, as if the wolves were playing a deadly game. They're scattering, Elias said, straightening up, his voice grim. Trying to divide us. Or they're just showing off, Cain countered, his eyes following a single bold set of prints that led directly into the densest part of the forest. The Alpha wants us to follow. It's a challenge. A tense silence fell over the group. The warmth of the town was a memory, and the gold bounty seemed like a fool's dream. They were no longer hunters on a mission, but trespassers in a territory ruled by an unknown and terrifying power. Liam's hand trembled as he clutched his rifle. Maybe we should go back. We can tell them what we found. The town will understand. No. Cain's voice was a low, guttural growl, cutting through Liam's words. We don't go back. Not now. Not when we're this close. He didn't look at them. His eyes locked on the tracks, a cold fire burning in their depths. The memory of his past hunt, of his partner's final, silent moments, was a ghost in the air around him. He knew that to turn back now would not be an act of survival, but an admission of defeat to the very thing that haunted his nightmares. He took a single, determined step, following the tracks of the alpha wolf. Just as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, casting the forest in a deep, unsettling blue, they found something new, something that made the skin on their necks crawl. Buried beneath a thin layer of freshly fallen snow was a familiar object, a weathered leather glove. It was not one of theirs. It belonged to the lone hunter who had set out a week before them, a man known for his skill and fearlessness. The glove was pristine, not a single tear or stain on it. It had been left there deliberately as a calling card. But what truly froze them was the sight of a single, five-clawed print right next to it. They had just found a warning, not of a pack ahead of them, but of a pack that had been watching them this entire time. And as a low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows of the forest, the hunters knew they were no longer following the tracks. The tracks had led them to a trap. Chapter 6. The first howl. The low, guttural growl didn't come from a single throat. It resonated from the very air, a vibration that shook the snow from the pine branches and settled like a cold stone in the hunters' stomachs. It was a sound that had no source, a deep, rumbling presence that seemed to come from all around them at once. Liam's eyes, wide with pure terror, darted wildly from one shadowed patch of forest to another. He raised his rifle, his hands shaking so badly he could barely aim. "Where are they?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't see anything." Elias, his face a grim mask, gripped his rifle tighter, his years of experience telling him that this wasn't a normal hunt. He scanned the tree line, his instincts screaming at him that they were surrounded. "Don't shoot unless you have a clear target," he commanded, his voice strained. "They're playing with us." But even as he said the words, a sickening realization dawned on him. They weren't just playing, they were testing them. A new, terrifying sound, a soft scuttling, echoed from their left, followed by another from their right, and then a third from behind. The sounds were too quiet, too fast. They weren't a pack of animals surrounding them. They were a phalanx of silent, unseen terrors, weaving a net of sound and fear. Ilara closed her eyes for a moment, letting her other senses take over. She felt the pull of the unnatural cold, a vortex of dread at the center of the clearing. She could almost feel the presence of dozens of eyes, unseen and impossibly intelligent, watching their every move, dissecting their fear. This wasn't a hunt for food, it was a hunt for sport. This was the reckoning her grandmother had spoken of. This was the wild, reclaiming what was lost, and they were the instruments of its balance. She opened her eyes and looked at Cain, who was standing unnervingly still, his gaze fixed on the darkness. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Then it came. Not another growl, but the howl. It started as a single low note, a mournful lament that seemed to bend and warp the air around them. Then it was joined by another and another, until the forest was a deafening chorus of agonizing sound. The howl was not a cry of a beast. It was a symphony of despair. It was the sound of 1,000 lost souls, of 1,000,000 frozen whispers echoing through the vast, empty expanse of the frontier. The sound vibrated in their bones, in their teeth, in their very thoughts. Liam let out a short, terrified sob and stumbled back, clutching his ears. The howl felt like it was inside his head, an invisible blade scraping at his sanity. As the last echoes of the horrific sound faded into an unnerving silence, a new sound cut through the stillness. A sharp crack. A tree, a massive oak 50 feet away, suddenly shuddered and then snapped in half with the sound of splintering bone, its top half crashing down into the snow with a thunderous thud. There was no visible cause, no beast to be seen. It was as if the very force of the howl had shattered the wood. It was an impossibly powerful, terrifying display of a force that defied all logic. The hunters stood in the freezing silence, looking at the broken tree. They had heard the wolves' first howl, and it was not a sound of warning. It was a sound of absolute, unquestionable dominance. The game had begun, and they had already lost the first move. They were surrounded, and the wolves were now ready to strike. Chapter 7. Campfire Doubts. The fire they had built felt small and insignificant, a fragile circle of light against the vast, crushing darkness of the wilderness. The crackle of the flames was the only sound, a desperate rhythm against the deep, unnatural silence of the forest. They had moved a mile from the broken tree, but its silent, splintered form was a ghost in their minds, a constant reminder of the impossible force they were facing. The bounty now felt like a curse, a chain binding them to this frozen hell. Liam huddled closest to the fire, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror that no amount of heat could thaw. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "We have to go back," Liam finally said, his voice a strained whisper, his eyes pleading. "Elias, that wasn't natural. That was something from the old stories, something evil. We're not hunters. We're bait." He looked at each of them in turn, a desperate plea in his eyes. "We saw what they can do. We heard them. This isn't a wolf hunt. It's a suicide mission." Elias stared into the flames, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of steaming coffee. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, was etched with a deep weariness. "The kid's got a point," he conceded, his voice low and grim. "I faced grizzlies, cougars, even a wolverine that didn't know when to quit. But this is different. It's too smart, too patient. They didn't even show themselves. They just broke a tree to show us they could." He looked at the shadows, a lifetime of wilderness knowledge telling him to turn and run. But something else, a deep-seated pride and a commitment to the cause, held him in place. Ilara sat a short distance away, sharpening her hunting knife with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The blade glinted in the firelight. "My grandmother told me the legends were a test," she said without looking up. "A test of courage, of wit, a challenge. These wolves aren't just animals. They're guardians of the wild soul. And we have violated their territory. They won't let us go back." Her words were chillingly matter-of-fact, lacking any trace of fear. For her, this was a validation of everything she had been taught, a terrifying rite of passage that was now her reality. Cain simply sat in silence, his back against a tree, his rifle across his lap. He hadn't said a word since they made camp. His eyes, fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight, were a window into a private war he was fighting. He wasn't just here for the money or for a challenge. He was here for a final confrontation with a demon from his past. He knew what Liam and Elias were feeling. He had felt it before, a crippling terror that promised an agonizing end. But he also knew that turning back was no longer an option. The wolves had marked them. Liam stood up, his desperate fear turning to a frantic resolve. "I'm not waiting here to die," he declared, his voice trembling but firm. "I'm going back. I can make it to the river by morning." He turned, taking a step toward the darkness, toward the trail they had carved just hours before. But just as he did, a low, single note, a sound that was a low growl and a high-pitched whine all at once, emanated from the darkness, impossibly close. It wasn't a growl that promised an attack. It was a sound of amusement, a laugh. They were still there. They had watched them make camp, listened to their fears, and were now taunting them. Liam froze, his heart pounding in his chest. They were trapped. They were surrounded. and the wolves were just beginning their game. The campfire flickered, the light casting dancing shadows on their terrified faces, the chilling sound of that laugh echoing in their ears, mocking their every desperate thought. Chapter 8. Signs of the Hunt. The pale morning sun was a cold, distant eye in the sky. It offered little warmth and no comfort. The hunters had survived the night, but barely. The memory of the mocking howl and the terrifying snap of the tree was a fresh wound in their minds. They had slept little, their hands on their weapons, their eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the flickering embers. The first light of dawn revealed the stark truth. The tracks of the giant wolves circled their campsite, a perfect, unbroken ring, as if they had spent the entire night watching, waiting, and toying with their prey. The tracks weren't a sign of an ambush. They were a sign of absolute, undeniable control. The wolves had been toying with them. Liam, his face gaunt with exhaustion, stared at the tracks, a look of profound horror in his eyes. "They were just watching us," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "All night. They could have killed us at any moment." Elias, however, saw a different message. "They wanted us to know that," he said, his voice hard. "They wanted us to be afraid. Fear makes mistakes." He pointed to a set of prints that veered away from the camp. "They've left us a trail, and this time it's not a trap. It's an invitation." The veteran was right. The tracks led in a deliberate path, a clear sign that the pack was moving, and they were leading the hunters directly to them. Ilara followed the tracks, her movements sure and steady despite the dread. She noticed a pattern in the way the prints were laid out, a strange, almost methodical gait. "This is not how animals move," she observed, her voice low. "This is purposeful. They're leading us to their den, or their hunting grounds, to a place where they have the advantage." She was no longer just a hunter. She was an anthropologist of the impossible, trying to decipher the rules of a new, horrifying world. She saw in the perfect spacing of the prints the cold, alien intelligence her grandmother had warned her about. Cain simply followed, his face a mask of grim determination. He didn't speak, but his eyes were alive with a terrifying mix of dread and anticipation. He had seen this before. The taunting, the playing with their prey. His past, a brutal, unspoken wound, was now a map, showing him where this path would lead. He knew that this was no longer a chase. This was a journey to the heart of the beast, and he was ready for it. The tracks led them for hours, deeper into the desolate, snow-covered landscape. The forest gave way to a vast, frozen expanse, a silent white desert. They saw more signs of the hunt. Not just animal kills, but signs of human presence brutally undone. A trapper's camp, its walls ripped open as if by a giant hand, the supply crates scattered, their contents untouched. A lone sled, its dogs gone, its cargo of pelts meticulously shredded and left to blow in the wind. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the human presence had been simply erased, vanished without a fight. The terror in Liam's eyes grew with each new sign. "They're hunting us," he whispered, the realization finally sinking in. "They're not just hunting for food. They're hunting us for a reason." As the sun reached its zenith, they came to the edge of a great ravine. A cold mist rose from its depths, obscuring the bottom. The tracks stopped abruptly at the edge, a chilling end to the trail. But on a large boulder at the precipice there was a new message, left for them to find. It was a perfectly preserved hunting knife, the kind used by a seasoned trapper, its hilt turned to face them, as if inviting them to take it. And tied to its handle, with a piece of gut, was a single, human finger. It was a brutal, personal message. They had been led here. And as the chilling mist from the ravine below began to swirl and writhe, a new sound, a deep, mournful howl, rose from the darkness, echoing up from the depths of the ravine below. They had found the lair, and the pack was now waiting for them to descend. Chapter 9. The River Crossing. The discovery at the ravine's edge, the deliberate, grotesque message, was a cold fist to the gut. The human finger, tied to the knife, was a declaration of war. They weren't just being hunted. They were being toyed with, their every move predicted. The howl from the ravine below beckoned them, a challenge that left no room for retreat. Elias, his face pale and grim, knelt, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched the knife. "He was a good man," he muttered, his voice thick with a mix of grief and rage. "One of the best trackers on the frontier, and they made sure we knew it." Liam stared into the swirling mist of the ravine, his mind a panicked whirlwind. "They're leading us down there. It's a trap, a final one." He looked at Cain, who remained impassive. "Why are we doing this? We have to go back. We can warn the others. There are more of us." "There is no more of us," Cain said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "They've already marked us. They won't let us leave." He looked at the knife, his eyes filled with a weary, terrible knowledge. "This isn't a trap to kill us. This is a trap to break us." Without another word, he began his descent down the narrow, treacherous path that hugged the ravine wall. The others, knowing he was right, followed. The descent was a test in itself, the air growing colder with every step, the rocks slick with a thin layer of ice. The swirling mist obscured their vision, making them feel as if they were stepping into a different world, a world of shadows and chilling secrets. At the bottom, a frozen river snaked through the ravine floor. The ice was a patchwork quilt of grays and blacks, with open veins of dark, rushing water cutting through it like gaping wounds. The river was their only way forward. To the left and right, the ravine walls stretched for as far as the eye could see, a dead end. Elias cautiously stepped onto the ice, testing it with the butt of his rifle. It groaned under his weight, a sound like a coffin lid scraping shut. "We'll have to go in single file," he instructed, his voice low and tense. "Step where I step. No sudden movements." The crossing was a ballet of terror. Each step was a gamble, a test of faith in the strength of the cracking ice. The sounds were magnified in the silent ravine, the splintering groan of the ice, the gentle sloshing of the frigid water, the frantic beat of their own hearts. Liam slipped once, a terrified gasp escaping his lips as his foot disappeared into an open patch of water. He was pulled back to solid ice by a strong hand. Cain's. For a moment, their eyes met. Cain's were not a predator's, but a fellow survivor's, a grim empathy passing between them. As they reached the middle of the river, where the ice was thinnest and the mist swirled the thickest, Ilara pointed, her finger trembling. "Look." Below the surface of the black water, impossibly large shadows were moving, long, sinewy shapes that seemed to glide effortlessly under the ice. They weren't fish. They were massive, powerful creatures, moving in silent, synchronized harmony beneath their feet, their eyes a faint, ghostly green that seemed to glow in the darkness of the river. They were in the middle of a bridge of ice, with unseen monsters below them and a rising mist ahead. Then, with a sound like 1,000 gunshots, the ice around them began to crack, not randomly, but in a deliberate circle. They were standing on a fragile island, and the wolves were now ready to claim their territory. And as the mist on the far bank began to swirl and writhe, a new sound, a deep, triumphant howl, echoed from the other side. A massive shape, its eyes glowing with a malevolent, pulsating green, emerged from the mist. It was the Alpha. It was waiting for them. The hunt was over. The game had begun. Chapter 10. Shadows in the Forest. The triumphant howl of the alpha wolf was the sound of a closing door, a final nail in a coffin of ice. The group stood on their rapidly shrinking island of cracking ice, faced with the massive, glowing-eyed specter on the far bank. There was no hesitation, no time for discussion. "Run!" Elias roared, his voice cutting through the terrifying symphony of snapping ice. With a surge of adrenaline, they scrambled towards the opposite bank, leaping over gaping fissures and sliding on slick ice. The sound of the ice breaking behind them was a terrifying, thunderous roar, a sound of a natural force being weaponized. The water below was a black, hungry maw, and the silent, massive shadows beneath the surface moved with an unnatural speed, keeping pace with them. They hit the far bank, scrambling up the muddy incline and crashing into the dark tree line. They were exhausted, soaked from the frigid water, and their lungs burned with the cold. They had escaped the river, but they had entered the wolf's true domain. The forest here was different. The pines were so thick they blotted out the last of the pale sunlight, plunging them into a world of eternal twilight. And the shadows seemed to writhe and dance, taking on forms that were too fleeting to be real. A shape like a wolf, but impossibly thin and tall, would flicker behind a tree trunk. A pair of glowing eyes would vanish as soon as they saw them. The sounds they heard were not the crunch of paws on snow, but a low rustling like dry leaves from places where there were no leaves. Liam, his nerves frayed, let out a short, terrified sob. "What is this place? They're everywhere, but they're not there." He fired his rifle into a dense thicket, the shot a deafening roar in the oppressive silence. Nothing moved, but from behind them, a tree trunk that had been perfectly smooth now had a single massive claw mark gouged into it. The wolves were not just using the shadows. They were part of them. The veteran hunter Elias, who had a lifetime of experience tracking silent predators, was shaken to his core. He remembered a story he'd heard as a boy, a legend of a hunter who went mad, seeing ghosts in the woods until he became one himself. He had scoffed at the tale, but now he was living it. Every flicker of movement, every shifting shadow, felt like 100 eyes fixed on him, judging him, waiting for him to break. Ilara, her eyes now wide and alert, moved with a newfound purpose. "They want to hunt us without touching us," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "They're hunting our minds, our courage." She could feel the pack's presence as if it were a physical force, a deep-seated cold that radiated from the darkness. She recognized this as the heart of her grandmother's lore, the ultimate test of a hunter. This was a battle not of strength, but of will. Cain simply walked forward, a grim look of resolution on his face. He seemed impervious to the psychological terror, his focus unwavering. He had seen these shadows before in his nightmares, the ones that had followed him back from his last hunt. He knew their game. He knew that the torment was just a prelude to the true ambush. Just as he was about to speak, to warn the others, a new sound cut through the frantic silence. A sharp snap, a low grunt, and then a strangled, terrifying cry. It was from Liam. He had been right beside them just a moment ago. But now, when they turned, he was gone. There were no sounds of a struggle, no paw prints in the snow, just a single thin line of red on the ground where he had stood. The shadows had claimed their first victim. They were now only 3, and the forest had grown a little darker. The hunt was no longer a game. It was a massacre. Chapter 11. The first attack. Liam's terrified cry had been cut short with an abrupt, chilling silence. One moment he was there, a terrified but living presence, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the shadows that now seemed to close in on them. A single dark stain on the pristine snow was all that remained. Elias, a veteran of countless brutal encounters, felt a cold surge of rage and panic. "Liam! Where did you go, damn it?" he roared into the oppressive silence, his rifle raised. A low, mocking growl answered him, a sound that seemed to come from directly behind a massive pine tree just ahead of them. Elias swung his rifle, firing a shot that tore through the air, splintering the bark of the tree. But there was nothing there, just a swirling cloud of snow kicked up by a passing gust of wind. Or something else. Then, from the left, a flicker of movement, impossibly fast. A flash of a massive dark shape moving too quickly to be anything other than a blur. Ilara, her senses on high alert, raised her own rifle and fired. A whimper, a sound like an infant's cry, and the blur vanished. But it was only a distraction. From the right, another shadow, faster still. It darted out of the darkness and slammed into Elias with the force of a battering ram. The veteran was thrown back, his rifle clattering to the ground. He landed hard in the snow, his head hitting a rock with a sickening thud. The wolf was a dark, massive silhouette, its eyes glowing with that familiar malevolent green, a phantasm of a beast from a nightmare. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, melting back into the shadows. Ilara ran to Elias, who was dazed but conscious. A long, deep gash ran across his shoulder, his coat ripped to shreds, blood seeping into the snow. "They're not real," he mumbled, his eyes wide with disbelief. "They're not. They don't take a hit. They're not made of flesh and bone," Ilara said, her voice strained. "They're made of something else. They're trying to break us." She helped him to his feet, her eyes darting between the trees. The wolves were not hunting. They were toying. Cain, however, stood his ground, a grim look of grim satisfaction on his face. He hadn't fired a shot. He knew that the bullets were useless. He had dropped his rifle and drawn his massive hunting knife, its blade glinting in the meager light. He was a man fighting a different kind of war, and just as a shadow began to solidify behind him, a shape of impossible proportions, he spun, his knife slicing through the air with the speed of a striking viper. He didn't connect with flesh. He connected with something else. There was a sound like shattering glass, a high-pitched, inhuman shriek, and a small fragment, a shard of black, crystalline ice, fell to the snow, dissipating instantly. The shadow of the wolf shimmered and then was gone. "They're not shadows," Cain rasped, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "They're not ghosts. They're just fast, and they bleed, but not blood." A new sound, different from the others, cut through the silence. A high-pitched, mocking giggle. It was a sound that belonged in a child's nursery rhyme, but here, in the cold, dark woods, it was the most horrifying sound they had ever heard. And from the direction of the sound, a single, impossibly large paw print appeared in the snow, its 5 claws etched with a malicious precision. But this time, it was a deeper imprint, as if the wolf had deliberately pressed down hard. Elias, dazed and bleeding, looked down at it, a terrible realization dawning in his eyes. "That's not just a track," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That's a promise." The cold, wet feeling spreading across his chest and the sharp, nauseating pain in his side caused him to look down. A thin, dark line of crimson was seeping through his coat, right where the shadow had brushed past him. He had been so focused on the gash on his shoulder, he hadn't noticed the second, deeper wound. The wolves were not just playing. They had left their mark. And as Elias's knees buckled, a familiar sound, a triumphant, guttural howl, echoed through the trees, closing in. He was a man marked for death, and the wolves were coming to collect their due. Chapter 12. Blood on the Snow. Elias's fall was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow, agonizing descent into the cold. His knees buckled, his rifle clattering uselessly to the snow, and he sank to the ground, his hand clutching the wound on his side. The triumphant howl of the wolves was no longer just a sound, it was a celebration. Cain and Ilara were instantly at his side, their faces a mix of terror and grim determination. "Elias!" Ilara cried, her voice strained. She tore open his coat, her eyes widening in horror at the sight of the wound. It was not a gash, not a tear. It was a single, clean puncture wound, as if from a monstrous, five-clawed hand. The blood seeping from it was not red, but a viscous, dark fluid that steamed in the frigid air, smelling of ozone and something rotten. It's not blood," Elias rasped, a mix of disbelief and fear in his eyes. He remembered a story from his youth, told to him by an old, reclusive trapper who swore he had seen such a thing. A wound that wasn't a wound, a poison of the spirit. He had scoffed at the old man's wild tales then, but now, with a cold, numbing pain spreading from his side, he understood. This was not a physical ailment. It was a spiritual one. He was being consumed from the inside out. Cain, however, was not focused on the wound's unnatural nature. He was focused on the wolves. They were no longer invisible. Now, drawn by the scent of the dark blood, their shadows began to solidify at the edge of the firelight. Glimpses of impossibly large frames, of glowing green eyes, of teeth that seemed to be made of polished obsidian. They were not charging. They were circling, their movements slow and deliberate, a macabre dance of death. They knew they had won. They were just waiting for the final curtain to fall. "Don't waste bullets," Cain said to Ilara, his voice a low, gravelly command. "They're just playing with us. Get him to his feet." But Elias, with a final surge of strength, shook his head. "No," he said, his voice fading. He looked at Cain and then at Ilara, his eyes holding a lifetime of unspoken wisdom. "My father told me, a man lives as long as he fights." He didn't say anything about the things you can't fight. A memory flashed in Elias's mind. A young boy, a father, and a lesson in a sun-drenched field. "Son, always know when to cut your losses. The greatest victory is living to fight another day." But now, facing a foe that defied all logic, he knew there was no victory to be found in retreat. There was only a final, desperate stand. "Go," he rasped, his eyes fixed on the encroaching shadows. "There's nothing you can do. The blood on the snow. It's mine. Don't make it yours, too." Ilara shook her head, her face wet with tears. "We don't leave people behind," she cried, but she knew it was a futile gesture. She could feel the icy presence of the wolves closing in, their malevolent energy a physical weight on the air. Cain, with a brutal, clear-headed practicality that bordered on cruelty, grabbed her arm. "He's right," he said, his voice flat. "He's done. We're not." He pulled her away. Elias, left alone, watched them go, a small, weary smile on his face. He knew he was about to become the final, bloody trophy of a hunt that had gone on for centuries. He raised his rifle one last time, his body trembling with the effort. As the wolves, now fully revealed, their forms massive and black as night, closed in, their eyes glowing with an unholy light, he took a deep, final breath. He didn't fire. He didn't scream. With a last act of defiance, a final moment of pride, he simply looked them in the eye, a silent challenge in his fading gaze. The lead wolf, the alpha, stopped. It was a moment of perfect, terrible stillness. And then it lunged. A flash of teeth, a sound of tearing cloth, and a final guttural cry. And the veteran hunter was gone. Cain and Alara didn't look back, but the howl of triumph that echoed behind them told them everything they needed to know. They were only two now, and the trail of blood on the snow was a terrible reminder of the cost of their survival. Chapter 13. The Alpha Revealed. The air behind them was rent by a final guttural howl, a sound of savage triumph that needed no translation. It was the death knell of a brave man. Cain and Alara ran, their feet pounding against the snow, their lungs burning. But the sound of Elias's final moments was a ghost at their heels. They didn't dare look back. They ran until they could run no more, collapsing in a small, ice-covered gully, their bodies shaking, their grief a silent scream. The world around them had become a graveyard, and they were the last two mourners. In the silence that followed, a new emotion began to bloom in their hearts, a cold fire that pushed aside the terror. It was not courage, it was rage, a raw, burning need for vengeance that eclipsed all doubt and fear. Cain, his face a mask of stone, simply looked at Alara, a silent question in his eyes. She met his gaze, and in that moment, a new, unspoken pact was forged between them. They were no longer two scared hunters. They were the survivors, and they would not go down without a fight. They walked for hours, their purpose now a grim and unyielding resolve. They no longer spoke. There was nothing to say. The howl of the Alpha had said it all. The world was cold and filled with a terrible, unholy power, and they had just witnessed it take one of their own. They were the last two standing. The hunted had become the hunters, seeking not to escape, but to avenge. As the sun began to sink, casting long, menacing shadows across the snow, they came to a vast, open expanse, a frozen lake nestled between two jagged peaks. The moon was a pale ghost in the sky, casting a soft, eerie light on the pristine snow. And then they saw it. It was not a flicker of movement in the shadows, not a blur of impossible speed. It was a solid, undeniable presence. Standing in the center of the frozen lake, silhouetted against the moonlight, was the Alpha. It was a creature of myth made real. It stood taller than a man on all fours, its body a massive, powerful silhouette of muscle and bone. Its fur was the color of midnight, absorbing all light, and its eyes, they were not green anymore. They pulsed with a cold, malevolent blue, like twin stars made of pure ice. Its form was perfect, a terrifying monument to a forgotten species of predator, and on its massive paws, they could clearly see the fifth claw, a single curved spike of dark obsidian. This was not a wolf. This was a king, a god of the wilderness. The Alpha did not move. It simply stood there, watching them from 100 yards away, its head held high, its presence a physical weight in the cold air. It wasn't a show of force. It was a declaration of its kingdom. It had driven them to its throne room, and now it was waiting for them to make a final move. It knew they were seeking revenge. It knew they would come, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the Alpha lowered its head and pawed at the ice, gouging a deep, five-clawed print. It then lifted its head, its eyes fixed on them, and let out a new kind of howl. It was not a roar of triumph, not a sound of mockery. It was a command. It was a direction. It pointed them towards a massive, dark cave on the far side of the lake, a cavernous maw that seemed to swallow the light. This was it, the final destination, the lair of the beast. And as Cain and Alara looked at each other, their faces grim but resolute, they knew there was no turning back. They had been invited, and they were going to accept. Chapter 14. A fractured group. The Alpha's invitation, a clear, silent command pointing towards the dark maw of the cave, hung in the frigid air. The massive wolf remained in the distance, a patient god of the wilderness, watching as the last two survivors made their decision. There was no need for words. Cain's eyes were fixed on the cave, a cold fire of vengeance burning in their depths. He didn't even look at Alara. His path was clear, and it was a path of no return. Alara, however, hesitated, her gaze darting between the menacing cave and the impossible figure on the frozen lake. The fractured group was not a split of bodies, but of minds. They began to cross the lake, the vast, open expanse of ice, a terrifying blank canvas under the cold moonlight. Every step was a declaration of their purpose, a march towards a fate that seemed predetermined. The silence here was different from the forest. It was a profound, suffocating emptiness. They were two tiny specks against a backdrop of mountains and sky, utterly exposed, utterly alone. The air was so still that their every breath, their every footfall, felt like a thunderclap. Alara finally broke the silence, her voice a low, strained whisper. "He's just waiting for us," she said, gesturing with her head toward the motionless Alpha. "He's watching us walk into a trap. This isn't courage, Cain. It's madness. Why are you so set on this?" Cain didn't stop, but he looked at her, and in his eyes, a brief, haunting shadow passed. "I saw him," he rasped, his voice raw with unspoken pain. "Not a pack, just him, last time." A flash of a memory, a nightmare from his past, filled his mind. The blizzard, the camp he shared with his partner, the sudden silence, and then the flicker of a shadow, a presence that was massive and utterly silent. He remembered the feeling of helplessness as the beast moved through their camp, and the chilling finality of his partner's last, desperate cry. He remembered escaping, crawling through the snow, carrying a wound far deeper than any knife could make. He hadn't just lost a hunting partner. He had lost a piece of his soul. Alara's eyes widened with a dawning understanding. He wasn't just here for the bounty. He was here for a final reckoning. This wasn't a hunt for him. It was a pilgrimage. "He took something from you," she said, her voice filled with a terrible sympathy. "He left me alive," Cain growled, the words a bitter confession. "Left me to live with the fear, to be a ghost. He won't get to do it twice." His face was grim, a mask of unyielding resolve. His purpose was no longer about survival or vengeance for Elias. It was a brutal, personal war for his own soul. Alara realized then that they were two very different people. She was a hunter following a legend. He was a survivor following a demon. The two of them, the last of the group, were united by a single purpose, but they were fractured by their motivations as they finally reached the far side of the lake, their boots crunching on the rocky shore. They saw it. The mouth of the cave was a gaping wound in the side of the mountain, and there, etched into the smooth stone by what looked like impossibly long claws, was a single message, written in a language that was not of this world, but that spoke a clear, terrifying truth. It was a symbol of the five-clawed wolf, and beneath it, a word carved with a terrible precision: welcome. The air from the cave was colder than the outside, and carried with it a faint, nauseating scent of decay and ancient bones. They were standing at the threshold of a final descent into darkness, a place where all the legends were born. The two of them, broken, exhausted, and yet resolute, stared into the blackness, knowing that the real terror was not in the hunt, but in the lair that awaited them. They had walked into the trap, and now the door was closing behind them. Chapter 15. The Cave of Bones. The welcome etched in stone felt less like an invitation and more like a final threat. With a shared, grim look, Cain and Ilara stepped through the maw of the cave, leaving the pale moonlight behind. The air inside was not just cold, it was a stagnant, dead chill that carried the faint, nauseating scent of decay. The darkness was absolute, swallowing the meager light from their torches, making the world shrink to a small, flickering circle around them. Every step they took, a muffled crunching sound, sent a cold shiver down their spines. The floor wasn't stone. It was covered in something else. They held their torches higher, and the light revealed the horrifying truth. The ground beneath their feet was a grotesque mosaic of bones. Animal bones, yes, but also human. The scattered remains of men and women who had dared to venture into this place, and lost. Skulls with clean, five-clawed holes in their foreheads, femurs snapped cleanly in half, ribs arranged in strange, ritualistic patterns on the floor. This was not a den. It was a trophy room, a chilling testament to the wolf's long and bloody reign. A flashback of Ilara's grandmother telling a story of the sacred burial grounds of the old ones, a place where the bones of the unworthy were kept. And she suddenly understood. This was not a place of killing. This was a place of eternal damnation. Cain's face, a mask of grim resolve, didn't flinch. He recognized the symbols on the cave walls, crudely carved with a five-toed claw, a language of death that he had seen in his nightmares. He stepped over a shattered jawbone, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. He wasn't a stranger to death, but this was an artist's touch, a master killer's collection. He found a partially buried piece of leather and pulled it free. It was a well-worn trapper's satchel, its contents scattered, a compass, a broken watch, and a small, faded photograph. A memory, cold and sharp, flashed in his mind. The face of the trapper from the bounty poster, his brave smile, and the hopeful light in his eyes. It was a personal, brutal message from the Alpha, a constant reminder that their journey would end in this place, among the bones of the fallen. Ilara's breath hitched as her torchlight fell upon a more recent collection of bones. Lying in a small clearing was a pile of clothing, not from decades ago, but from yesterday. A familiar, dark leather coat, its buttons torn away, its pockets ripped open. It was Elias's. And next to it, partially obscured by a pile of elk bones, was a single, untouched hunting knife, the one Cain had given him back in town. The knife was a final, cold trophy. The wolves had taken his body, but they had left a piece of him behind as a final, brutal message. A single, muffled thump from the darkness ahead made them freeze. It was followed by another, and then another, a slow, deliberate sound that resonated through the cavern, a rhythmic pounding that was not from a living creature. It was the sound of a rock, being dislodged from the cavern ceiling, falling with a terrible finality. The wolves were not in here with them. Not yet. But they had activated something, a defense mechanism, a signal. And as the sound of falling rock echoed through the cavern, Cain and Alara looked at each other, a new, terrible realization dawning in their eyes. They had just entered a place of eternal rest, and the silence was now preparing to bury them. The Cave of Bones was about to claim 2 more victims. Chapter 16. Descent into Darkness. The sound of falling rock was a grim invitation, a signal to descend deeper into the heart of the mountain. With a shuddering groan, a section of the cavern wall, a massive slab of stone, slid open, revealing a new, yawning blackness. It wasn't just a tunnel. It was a descent into pure night, a path that swallowed the light from their torches, leaving them feeling as if they were standing at the edge of the world. The air that flowed from it was so cold, it burned their lungs, and it carried a new, unfamiliar scent, a metallic tang, and a subtle, unsettling aroma of decay. Cain's eyes, grim and resolute, were fixed on the opening. He didn't hesitate. "This is it," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper in the echoing void. "The final act." He held his torch high and stepped into the abyss. Alara, her face a mask of weary terror, followed. The path was narrow and slick with ice, and it descended at a steep, unforgiving angle. The sound of their footsteps was swallowed by the thick, oppressive darkness. The light from their torches was utterly useless, barely illuminating the ground a foot in front of them. The darkness here was not simply the absence of light. It was a physical weight, a living presence that pressed in on them from all sides, whispering cold secrets against their skin. Alara felt her fear shift from an external threat to an internal one. The whispers in the dark, the fleeting shapes she saw at the edge of her vision, were they real, or was her mind breaking? She gripped her rifle so tightly her knuckles went white. Her grandmother's stories of the spirits of the deep earth, of the things that lived in the heart of the mountains, flashed through her mind. This was the place of those stories, a place where a man's courage and a woman's sanity were tested to their breaking point. As they descended, the air grew so cold their breath froze instantly, creating a thin, icy film on their eyebrows and lashes. The walls of the tunnel, however, were not simply rock. They were carved, not with a tool, but with what looked like impossibly sharp claws in a strange, intricate pattern that snaked along the passage. The carvings were of wolves, of course, but not just any wolves. They were of the giant, 5-clawed creatures they had been hunting. But as their torchlight moved across the stone, they saw something new, something that made a cold dread bloom in their chests. Among the carvings of the wolves were human figures, their faces contorted in silent, agonizing screams, their bodies stretched and distorted, as if they were being pulled apart by an unseen force. This wasn't a lair. It was a hellscape. They came to a small, level chamber, and the source of the terrible decay scent was revealed. Piles of human bones, all stripped clean, were piled in a gruesome monument. The bones of the trappers and hunters who had been unlucky enough to cross paths with the Alpha, and among them, a macabre trophy. A half-eaten compass, its needle still spinning wildly, lost and desperate, just as its owner must have been. Then, from the darkness ahead, a new sound, a sound so soft and so chilling it made their blood run cold. It was not a howl or a growl or a whisper. It was a low, desperate moan, a sound of pain, of anguish, a human sound. It was weak, and it was pleading, and it was alive. The wolves were not just killing their victims, they were bringing them here. For what, they didn't know. But the sound of that terrible moan, of a final human plea, pulled them forward. They were no longer the hunters, and they were no longer the prey. They were witnesses to a final horror, and they knew that the next thing they found in the darkness would be the last thing they would ever see. The descent was over. The truth awaited them. Chapter 17. The Final Ambush. The low, desperate moan was a beacon in the suffocating darkness, a horrifying siren's call that pulled them forward. Their fear had been replaced by a grim determination. They weren't just hunting for vengeance anymore. They were on a rescue mission. The sound led them to a vast, echoing cavern, a chamber carved from pure ice and dread. The air here was so cold it burned their lungs, and a faint, ethereal blue light pulsed from the walls, revealing the scale of the horror. In the center of the chamber, chained to a jagged pillar of ice, was a man. He was barely alive, his body gaunt and bruised, his eyes wide with a manic terror that burned in the cold light. He was the hunter from the poster, the one whose finger they had found at the ravine. He was a piece of bait, a final sadistic lure. As Cain and Alara took a step forward, a low collective growl resonated through the cavern, and the shadows came alive. The pack was here, not as fleeting shadows or blurs of motion, but as physical, undeniable monsters. They emerged from every crevice, their eyes glowing, their bodies massive and powerful. There were dozens of them, a silent, terrifying army of nightmares, their fangs glinting in the pale light. And in the center, towering over the others, was the Alpha. It stood on a raised platform of jagged ice, its colossal frame a monument to pure, unadulterated terror. Its eyes pulsed with a brilliant, malevolent blue, a cold fire of ancient intelligence. The final confrontation had begun. Cain's eyes locked with the Alpha's. A memory cold and sharp as a shard of ice flashed in his mind. The image of his partner's horrified face just before the shadow had consumed him. He was not just fighting for his life. He was fighting to erase that moment. Alara, her face a mask of furious resolve, raised her rifle. "They're not invincible," she screamed, her voice a defiant roar against the silent menace. She fired, the shot echoing through the cavern, but the bullet simply ricocheted off the ice behind the Alpha. The pack charged, not as a unified front, but in a series of synchronized, terrifying blurs. They moved with an impossibly synchronized precision, a wave of dark, silent fury. Cain, dropping his useless rifle, pulled his knife, a grim warrior fighting a desperate final battle. He swung with a cold fury, his blade slicing through the air, managing to connect with one of the wolves, leaving a deep gash that bled not blood, but a thin black vapor. The wolf shrieked, a sound like grinding stone, and retreated, but it was just a temporary reprieve. The others were circling, getting closer. Alara was fighting with a desperate, animalistic ferocity. She fired at a target, then a second, her mind a frantic mix of hunter's logic and pure terror. She took one down, a massive beast that crumpled to the ground with a final, chilling howl. But as she reloaded, her focus split for a single, fatal moment. She heard a low, guttural growl right behind her. Before she could turn, a massive shape slammed into her, a crushing weight of fur and muscle that sent her flying into the cavern wall. Her body hit the stone with a sickening thud, her rifle clattering to the ground far away. She lay there, dazed and broken, a fine line of crimson seeping from her temple. Cain, in the middle of a desperate melee, saw her fall. A roar of primal rage tore from his throat. He plunged his knife into a wolf's side, the black vapor hissing as it came into contact with the air. But it was too late. He was alone. The pack, now having taken down the second hunter, turned their collective attention to him. The alpha descended from its perch, its massive form casting a terrifying shadow over the cavern. It was a victory march. Cain, surrounded, his knife dripping with the unholy blood of his enemies, knew this was the end. He was a man fighting a losing war. The cavern was silent, save for the rhythmic breathing of the beasts and the furious, desperate pulse of his own heart. The final ambush was over. The massacre had begun. Chapter 18. Only two remain. The cavern was silent, save for the ragged breathing of Cain and the low, guttural growls of the pack. Ilara lay motionless, a thin line of blood on her temple, a stark promise of her fate. Cain, surrounded by the shadows of 100 nightmares, raised his bloodied knife, a lone warrior in a final stand against an impossible foe. The alpha descended from its perch, its eyes glowing with a cold, triumphant light. It did not strike. It simply circled, its massive form casting a terrifying shadow, a king ready to take its final, glorious prize. Cain, however, was no longer fighting for his life. He was fighting for his soul. He had seen this before, felt this cold, mocking presence. He knew he couldn't win. He couldn't kill a ghost with a knife. He just had to buy time. He swung, not at the alpha, but at the lesser wolves, a desperate flurry of steel against fur and vapor. He connected with one, his knife slicing through its neck, and a high-pitched, agonizing shriek filled the cavern, followed by a puff of black, steaming vapor. The wolf dissolved, a dying wisp of smoke, a final testament to the unnatural nature of their enemy. But the others were too many. They closed in, their eyes burning with a collective malevolence. Then, from the ground, a weak, strained voice cut through the chaos. "The eyes! The stone! Cain!" It was Ilara, her voice a fragile thread, fighting against the crushing weight of her injuries. "The carvings! They're not just carvings. They're their lifeblood." Cain, in a brief moment of reprieve, looked at her. Her eyes, though clouded with pain, were fixed on the far wall of the cavern. He followed her gaze. The blue light from the walls was not a reflection. It was coming from veins of a strange, pulsating, crystalline rock that snaked across the cavern, a network of glowing, five-pointed symbols, the same symbols that were on the alpha's paws, the same symbols she had seen in her grandmother's lore. The cave was not just a lair, it was a heart. It was the source of their power, their invincibility, their unholy speed. They were not just wolves, they were living conduits of the mountain's power. A new memory, cold and sharp, flashed in Cain's mind. A flashback to his previous encounter. He hadn't just escaped. He had survived because he had stumbled into a crevice filled with this same glowing stone. The wolf that had been toying with him had suddenly faltered, its eyes dimming for a moment, giving him the precious seconds he needed to escape. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a survivor of a brief, momentary lapse in the wolf's power. The alpha, sensing his distraction, let out a triumphant roar and lunged, but Cain was ready. He didn't duck or run. He ran towards the alpha. The other wolves, confused, paused. As the massive beast lunged, Cain slid under its body, ignoring the flash of its claws, and with a desperate, final act of defiance, he slammed his knife into the crystalline vein of rock on the cavern wall. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic. A blinding flash of blue light filled the cavern, followed by a sound like 1,000 mirrors shattering at once. The pack shrieked, a chorus of agony, their forms flickering and distorting, their bodies becoming translucent and insubstantial. The alpha, its eyes dimming, let out a final, pained roar. Its physical form began to fade, its massive body becoming a wisp of vapor, its howl a dying whisper. The power was severed. The legend was broken. The pack, defeated and broken, vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a profound and terrible silence. Cain, battered and bleeding, crawled towards Alara. Her eyes were barely open, but a small, weary smile touched her lips. "I told you they weren't invincible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He knelt beside her, his hand on the wound on her head, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and terror. They were alive. They were the only two left. The long, impossible journey back through the cave of bones and across the endless, hostile wilderness had just begun. The bounty was a forgotten memory. The legend was now their own. They were the two who returned. And the world would never be the same. Chapter 19. The Return Home. The shattering silence that followed the pack's defeat was not a relief. It was a terrifying void, the aftermath of a war with a ghost. The pulsating blue light from the crystalline rock on the cavern wall faded, and the cavern was plunged into a deep, echoing darkness. Cain, battered and bleeding, his face a grim mask of weary triumph, knelt beside Alara. She was alive, but barely. The wound on her temple was ugly, and her breath was shallow. He used a strip of cloth torn from his own coat to bind the wound, a single act of desperate hope. He knew the fight was not over. The long, impossible journey back had just begun. He helped her to her feet, her body a dead weight against his. He slung her rifle over his shoulder and began the long, agonizing walk back through the cave. The cave of bones was now a tomb, a silent memorial to the dead. They passed the scattered remains of the hunters and trappers, their bones a grim reminder of the cost of their victory. They passed Elias's gear, a silent testament to his final brave stand. Cain and Alara didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Their unspoken grief, their shared trauma, was a heavy cloak that they carried with them through the suffocating darkness. Emerging from the mouth of the cave was a return to a world that felt alien. The air was no longer thick with dread, but a profound, eerie silence had taken its place. The cold was just the cold. The wind was just the wind. The forest was no longer an active enemy, but a silent, unblinking witness to a battle it would never forget. The journey back was a waking nightmare. Alara, her strength gone, leaned on Cain, her weight a constant burden on his battered body. He pushed on, his muscles screaming in protest, fueled by a grim determination that bordered on obsession. They passed the frozen river, a terrible graveyard of shattered ice, and the silent clearing where Liam had disappeared. Each location was a somber waypoint, a marker of their terrible journey. At Liam's last known location, Cain paused. A small wooden carving, a symbol of hope, was left untouched in the snow, a tribute to a young man's lost dreams. Cain left it where it was. The forest had its own secrets, and some were meant to remain. As the days turned into a blur of exhaustion and pain, their conversation was sparse. They were no longer two people. They were a single unit of survival. "Did you feel it?" Alara whispered one night, her voice a low rasp. "When it broke, the silence. It was like the world let out a breath." Cain nodded, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon. We didn't just break a pack of wolves, we broke a piece of the mountain itself. They were no longer just hunters. They were survivors of a confrontation with something ancient and terrible. Their souls were scarred, their faces etched with a weary wisdom that no gold could buy. And then, as the sun began to set on the 7th day of their long walk back, they saw it. In the distant valley below, a thin, wavering plume of smoke rose into the sky, a fragile sign of human life. The distant glow of a campfire, a promise of warmth and safety. A wave of profound, soul-deep relief washed over them, but it was tinged with a bitterness that only they could understand. They were returning home, but they were bringing the legend with them. Their victory was not a story of triumph, but a dark secret, a chilling tale of survival against a force that defied all logic. They were the two who had returned, but a piece of them would forever be lost in the wilderness, among the shadows of the silent, waiting mountains. Chapter 20. The legend lives on. The town of Blackwood Creek was a beacon of light against the endless, hostile darkness of the mountains. Its noise, a familiar symphony of clinking glasses, roaring fires, and the boisterous laughter of men and women, was a foreign language to Cain and Ilara. They walked into the heart of civilization, not as hunters returning with a prize, but as ghosts returning from the grave. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes held a haunted emptiness, and their bodies were a roadmap of wounds. The townspeople who had waited for their return looked at them with a mix of relief and terrified awe. They were the legends now. The town leader, the man who had offered the bounty, approached them, his hand outstretched with a pouch of gold. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "You slew the beasts." Cain, however, didn't even look at the gold. He looked at the faces around him, the hopeful, the fearful, the ignorant. They wanted a victory story, a tale of courage and bravado. But Cain had no such story to tell. He had a memory of a screaming man, a friend's dying gasp, and a silent, terrible monster that had haunted his soul. He was a survivor, not a victor. Without a word, he turned and walked away, a silent specter, his face a grim reminder that some demons are not meant to be shared. Ilara, however, stayed. She sat by the fire, the townspeople huddled around her, their eyes wide with a hungry curiosity. She told her story, but not for the gold. She told it for the truth. She spoke of a pack of wolves that moved like shadows, a beast that commanded the very stones of the mountain, a lair filled with the bones of the fallen. She spoke of the courage of Liam and Elias, of their tragic, impossible deaths, and of the unholy power they had defeated. But as she spoke, she saw the doubt in their eyes. They listened, they gasped, they were entertained. But they did not understand. For them, it was just another frontier tale, another tall story to be told around a campfire. She finished her tale, the firelight dancing in her eyes, and a small, bitter smile touched her lips. "The gold," she said, looking at the pouch, "is of no use to us. We came back with a different kind of prize. We came back with the truth." She turned to look at the silent, unforgiving mountains in the distance, a dark line against the night sky. The people were safe. The terror was gone. But the legend was not. It lived on in the whispers of the wind, in the carvings on the ancient cave walls, and in the nightmares of the two people who had returned from a war they were never meant to win. As the town fell into a peaceful, unsuspecting slumber, Ilara found Cain sitting alone by the river, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks. She sat beside him, the silence between them a comfortable, heavy weight. "They don't believe us," she said, her voice a low murmur. They don't have to, Cain responded, his voice a low rasp. They didn't see what we saw. They didn't hear what we heard. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw her own weariness, her own haunting knowledge. We won, but we didn't save them. We just bought them a little more time. And as if on cue, a single impossibly low sound, so soft it was barely audible, came from the distant mountains. It was not a howl of a wolf. It was a whisper on the wind. A final, chilling sound that only they could hear. A promise from the dark, silent wilderness that it was still out there, and it was waiting. The legend of the giant wolves was not a story of the past. It was a story of the future. The two who had returned had bought their town a brief, fragile moment of peace, but they had also become the living proof that some horrors are never truly defeated. And the legend lived on, a silent, terrible promise echoing in the darkness of the endless, waiting mountains.